This is lecture number 15 in the series The ABCs of Communism. Today we're going to talk about the fight for communism in Mexico. Fairly lengthy subject because the prehistory and history of Mexico is a fairly lengthy period of time. And what we want to do is, I'm going to try and put you in touch with the actual period of time, because I was involved in this struggle for the search for the prehistoric origins of man in the New World, or humans I might say, and also and especially in Mexico. My own involvement in this began with my doctoral research in the far north of British Columbia, where we had been on the trail of one of the earliest migrations into the New World. I'm not going to go into all of that except to say that this was also the stomping grounds for Richard S. McNeish in his earlier years. That is the Yukon, all the way from the British Columbia border to the Arctic Sea. And so in a sense I was following Dr. McNeish from those days when he had started out in archaeology and the search for the earliest migration into the New World into Mexico, where he was searching for the origins of agriculture. And historically, what had happened is that I had applied to go to the only school in the New World that had a Department of Archaeology separate from anthropology. I'd been accepted there. It had been created by McNeish, and I got there in 1968. And part of the deal was that they were going to get me research funds to do archaeology in the far north, because that's where I said I wanted to do my research. So as soon as I got to Calgary, I had been introduced to a man named Brian Gordon. I shared an office with him for a year. He had been in the far north of British Columbia the previous summer and had flown in there because he had been forced off the Arctic coast of the Yukon early, flown in there by a friendly pilot working for an oil company. And when he got out and he walked around just around the lake that they'd landed on, he saw that it was completely covered with obsidian tools. In other words, there'd been nobody in there to pick this stuff up until he arrived. So he showed me the bags of this stuff and the photographs of where it come from, and he had found several sites on an old dirt road that went alongside the cliff from Telegraph Creek northwards toward a town called Dease Lake. That was a trip that took several hours in those days because of the condition of the road, even though it was only probably about 30 miles in distance. At any rate, that gives you an idea of the area that we're in. And while I was there, I had conducted excavations which proved that there had been a distinctive migration out of Northeast Asia into Northwest America that arrived here, and that is in the Skeena River Valley drainage of northern British Columbia by 9,500 years ago. And we were able to trace it all the way from northern Japan through Siberia into across Alaska, and then down as the ice sheets melted into the Telegraph Creek region. Or they had come up the river from the ocean and had gotten in there that way the first time. But one or the other, we had the evidence for it in the form of microblade cores and microblade manufacture, which was so detailed, and we have in every piece of it, that it was identical to this Hokkaido, Japan complex of tools that had already been excavated over there and analyzed, and this was exactly the same thing. So from that time forward, everybody in my profession agreed that this was clear-cut proof of connection to Northeast Asia, and as a consequence I wrote my doctoral dissertation on it. Well, at the same time I had arrived in Calgary, Dr. McNeish had gone to take on his new job in the R.S. Peabody Foundation for Archaeological Research on the campus of the really class finishing school I called Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. And there he had research funds to do what he wanted, at least initially, which was to continue his work in the Tehuacan Valley of Mexico. Why Tehuacan? Well, first of all, McNeish had done the very first radiocarbon dates on archaeological remains in the Tamaulipas region. After a summer of working there, as he was pulling out of town, one of his Mexican field hands ran up to him with a little corn cob that he had just found, and McNeish stopped the movement out of the site, and I spent a couple more weeks there excavating that particular site. He sent this corn cob back to Chicago, where it was analyzed by Dr. Libby and others who were anxious to put their atomic science research to some kind of work other than making bombs. So that's how we got the first radiocarbon date ever, and how we got it first in Mexico. And what that told us was that this kind of primitive corn had lived down there for at least 4,500 years. This had been domesticated there 4,500 years ago. But it was still too sophisticated to have been the earliest phases, because the very first corn was just a one grass seed on top of a long blade of grass. So we had a lot of time to go between when that thing had evolved into, or because of human care, into this crude corn cob that dated 4,500 years ago. So we were in the middle of that. Now, in Tehuacan, about the time I got to Calgary, Dr. McNeish was down there digging a whole series of sites in that valley, because he had been able to triangulate that valley from his work in Tamaulipas to work over on the west coast of Mexico on another cave called Santa Marta Cave. And from what we knew about the origins of agriculture, which wasn't very much in the Mayan lowlands, eventually he had triangulated on the Tehuacan Valley, which is a semi-arid region of the state of Pueblo. And that is about 1,800 meters above sea level, so we could say that's about 6,000 feet. And it's very dry, so it's extremely good for preservation of anything that might fall into a cave deposit. And there were a series of caves, a series of open air sites that were excavated there. The prehistory of the Tehuacan Valley in 5 volumes was published in 1967 by the University of Texas Press in Austin, and edited by a man named Douglas Myers, as well as Richard S. McNeish. So you could find it in your libraries if you wanted to do that. I wrote also a complete study of all of the known sites, early man sites, or in the New World, that was published in 1982 in a volume called Peopling of the Americas, which is edited by Jonathan Erickson, and originally published by Ballina Press. Now you can get it in the used bookstores. I noticed before I started this lecture that there are some copies available of this book called Peopling of the New World. On the cover of it, you'll see my chart, which summarizes all of these early sites and shows how I think they flow in terms of how they got started, what's the oldest point in each of these 3 traditions. And today, nearly 40 years later, I could say that there's nothing that's changed in my mind about that general hypotheses. Things that have been excavated in the last 40 years that are relevant to early human in the New World studies are fall right into this pattern as far as I'm concerned. So you can look at that book, and you can also look at McNeish's book. Now, let's get down to the what the significance of this was. The period of primitive communism that began at least 40,000 years ago, we think, in Mexico, maybe earlier, because all of that will depend upon how early the first human sites in the New World are eventually determined to be. And this, as far as I can tell, those dates get earlier and earlier. And that lasted up until the invention of agriculture, which began in what McNeish called the El Riego stage of 7,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago. I'm not going to go through each one of those phases because I don't think it would mean that much to you now, but there are a series of phases that lead up to the time of white contact in 1540 in the Tehuacan Valley. By white contact we mean the arrival of these Spanish Ronin, who are adventurers out here to make as much money as they can one way or the other, operating pretty much on their own. Now, but at any rate, they were white, and it is contact, so it's not an official contact like government to government, because the Spanish crown didn't even know that these guys were there originally. Now, 1540 in the Tehuacan Valley is significantly after Cortez. It's another generation after Cortez's arrival in Mexico. So you can see that the spread of Spanish rule across what they called New Spain didn't occur immediately, but it took a while. Now, the essential aspect to sedentary life in the Tehuacan Valley was what we were looking for, what McNeish was looking for, and it was in the form of maize or corn, what we all call corn. Now, here in North America anyway, the earliest radiocarbon dates we have on formal corn come from about 5,000 BC, that is about 7,000 years ago in the Tehuacan Valley. So that is a really important date, and it's one that the Spaniards weren't able to do any damage to in the initial part because it took them this long to conquer this particular valley in the state of Puebla from the initial contact of, say, 1519, 1520, until now, and 20 years later. Now, I mentioned before when we started out this series that the reason that the Spanish were advanced over this particular group of early state societies is that the whole process of domestication of plants and animals had taken a couple thousand years longer in the New World than the Old World, for the simple fact that they didn't have anything to domesticate to speak of compared to what you had in the Old World, where you had cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens, pondable fish, just on the animal side. And then on the plant side, they had not only wheat, but barley, rye, oats, rice, all of these things. Those are just some of them, are rice seeds that they had to domesticate. Well, in the New World, you had a variety of plants that were experimented with by the peoples of North America, who built relatively high cultures in what we call the eastern woodlands. But the only thing that really paid off in terms of producing large amounts of calorie was corn. And that had to come up from, and did come up from Mexico, but it came up in a situation where they were already experimenting with native seeds. So they were ready for this. And once it arrived, it took off, not only in the eastern woodlands, but especially in the U.S. Southwest, which we know a lot about because of its proximity to Mexico, and because of the dry cave conditions that exist in Arizona, New Mexico, and the bordering parts of Utah and Colorado. So that's the Southwest culture area. Now, what happened there was, prior to Spanish contact, was exactly the same thing that had happened everywhere else in the world that we call a center of origin of civilization. And that is societies that evolved into simple chiefdoms. Those had faced the contradiction that we talked before that all simple chiefdoms eventually do, and some of them had made the transition to theocracy, advanced theocratic chiefdoms, where you have the beginning of the ranking of society and where the priests were playing an important role because of their control of the calendar and their knowledge of the seasons when corn should be planted or whatever should be planted. Corn, beans, and squash are the three big things that come out of Mexico and are the center of the agricultural complex that was invented down here in the Tehuacan area and then spread quickly into all of the neighboring regions. By quickly, I mean within hundreds of years. And then there's a whole suite of domesticated plants which come into the picture: tomatoes, cactus fruits. In your book, you're going to see a whole list of these domesticates and when they were domesticated. But at any rate, so the Mexicans were indigenously a couple thousand years behind the general course of evolution in Europe. Or the old world centers are China, Iraq, and Egypt. Now, these are areas where the same thing happened more or less about the same time in terms of the evolution of primitive communism into tribal agriculture, into primitive chiefdoms, and then into advanced theocratic chiefdoms. We know the most about advanced theocratic chiefdoms from Mexico and Peru because that's where most of the uninterrupted research has been conducted and continues to be conducted today. It doesn't look like there's going to be any likelihood that we'll be able to do any more work in either Egypt or along the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys because of the ongoing wars over oil. So in my lifetime, certainly, I don't expect anything to happen there. In McNeish's lifetime, he got tired of waiting for something to settle down in the Kurdistan region. I managed to talk him out of that, and he went to China instead. And there he did the same thing in China that he'd done in Mexico and Peru, which is to study the origins of agriculture. And of course, the domesticates vary from corn in Mexico to potatoes and the eventual arrival of corn into Peru from Mexico. And then in China, of course, rice was the key staple. All of these were, except for the potatoes, were domesticated grass seeds. Now, accordingly, the invention of metallurgy was a little bit slower in New Spain, that is in Mexico, so that when the Spanish arrived, they had steel and the Mexicans did not. There's some archaeological evidence to indicate that they were just inventing the way in which to smelt iron and make it into a hard, usable metal for whatever purpose, in the form of at least one tool that's been found in the region west of Mexico City. But we can see two things in Mexico very clearly, which we predict in theory based upon what we had already known about what happened in the Old World. And the theory predicted that in the stage of advanced theocratic chiefdoms, the point would come at which it would be impossible to maintain order with religion alone. But the first important point is that religion was invented. And for 1,000 years in Mexico and in Peru, it held sway over all of these primitive farming cultures, sticking with Mexico, of what we now call Mexico and Guatemala. So the second thing was, we also see in the sequence in Tehuacan the point at which the state, that is, standing bodies of armed men in the employ of somebody, an advanced rank of people that have access to the means of production, had emerged. And so that's exactly what should have happened also. So Mexico is a real key to us for testing sociocultural evolutionary theory. In Mexico, this early religion is called Olmec, and for those of you who have traveled to Mexico, you know that there are Olmec monuments everywhere from Vera Cruz to Villahermosa, and in the inland areas as well. What this religion does is teaches unity and voluntary giving over authority, and we talked a little bit about that before in this series. I won't repeat that. But eventually that becomes insufficient to maintain social order too, because there are so many inherent contradictions within the economy that sooner or later something goes wrong and you have large numbers of people who end up without anything. And this is the process of the introduction of civilization, or what we should also call a stage of slavery. So we see the transition from primitive communism into the stage of slavery very clearly as the Olmec religion itself gives way to state organization. Now, we know a number of ways in which wealth became acquired in private hands in Mexico. One of them would be long-distance trade, because in the lowlands of the Mayan region, that is the entire Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, you have these lowlands, and people don't have obsidian, hard rock, or salt. So these are things that they need to be, what they want to buy by trade. The trade is conducted by ranks within these advanced theocratic chiefdoms who are called Calpuli in the Aztec terminology, and they have maintained standing bodies of armed men to protect their caravans as they move back and forth from the highlands that have the hard stone and the obsidian from the volcanic activity, and also the salt that these people would like to have. So you have an excuse for armed force emerging initially as part of the protection of these caravans. And as society begins to disintegrate into people that have contending interests, these interests which are previously reflected in the ranking of society, these ranks have now become independent sociocultural classes with differential access to the means of production. So we see that clearly. We see that Olmec gives way to the emergence of actual state society, because in the ground we can see the emergence of places within these small city-states that have armories, that have barracks, barrack squares, places where soldiers live, train, and make their weapons or have weapons made for them. These we can see very clearly in that sequence. So, having said that, I want to move on to mention one new movie called Apocalypto that was done by our old friend Mel Gibson, who is a religious person, as you may know, but for some reason he seems to consistently produce the best Marxist analyses of history I've ever seen and make them into cinematic presentations. For a picture of what the advanced theocratic chiefdom stage looked like at the time of Spanish contact and the very early levels of state organization, you want to see his movie called Apocalypto, because he's got the whole thing right there. And he does it so much better than I could do in words. You'll see how that thing came together. Now, of these advanced theocratic chiefdoms that became city-states, one was known as Tolan. Now that's the contemporary city of Tula, which is north of the federal district, that is Mexico City. It fell apart in a civil war not long before Cortez arrived, about a century before, and a young man who was a nobleman in Tolan was named Quetzalcoatl, and he took his defeated troops to the Yucatan Peninsula, and kind of like General MacArthur, he promised that he would return at some future date. Well, he never did return, but this was a legend that was now stuck into the whole Mesoamerican culture. In the meantime, there was a group of Indians north of, well, actually, at one point they lived in what's southern Idaho now, in the part of the Great Basin that they migrated from into Mexico. And as they migrated, they became mercenary soldiers for various city-states. Now, for a city-state, but sitting on top of slave labor, it's dangerous to arm people within your own city-state, because generals always, and sometimes sergeants, get the idea that they can replace their employers. And when they do get that idea, then of course you've kind of defeated your own purpose if you're the one that's paying the state and owning all of the property, because they simply replace you. To avoid that, all of these city-states everywhere in the world traditionally like to hire mercenaries from somewhere outside of the immediate area and have them do the work that they need to be done to suppress their enemies in a neighboring city-state or to control their own revolting agricultural slaves for a variety of reasons. So when centuries later now the Spaniard Hernan Cortez arrives in Mexico, and all of this is completely new to him. The Spaniards have no previous knowledge of anything that's going on in Mexico. Cortez got there because he was an adventurer who had been looking for a way to get to the New World, and to Japan, actually, in China, and still following Columbus's idea that if you just kept going west, you'd get there. Essentially, that's what it boiled down to. Now, Columbus, as you know, had taken this, we'll go west until we landed something, and had hit the Bahamas, an island that's now called El Salvador. If you look at a map, you'll say, oh man, that's just a hop, skip, and a jump. If you look at the boats that Columbus came in, you'll say, God, how did they ever get anywhere in those things? I mean, those are tiny little boats. So, but they eventually did make it to the Bahamas. Now, Columbus spent the rest of his life trying to figure out where he was, and never did quite figure that out. That's why we call these islands down there next to the Bahamas, we call them the West Indies. He thought he was in the Indies, meaning Spice Islands, Indonesia. Of course he wasn't. He had just barely gotten into what we call the New World, and that apparently largely by luck. Well, by the time that Cortez arrived, he'd been a young man in Spain at the point where all of these rumors about what Columbus had found came back. And he had jumped onto a ship, and he'd gotten his way all the way to the Spanish island of what then was called Hispaniola, which today is Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And he had started out there. He'd built a ranch and a mine, slave labor that he conquered Indians there. And then he had gone to Cuba, did the same thing, set up a ranch not too far from what's the contemporary city of Santiago. And eventually he made an alliance with a woman who was the daughter of the governor, the Spanish governor of Havana. Well, to make a long story short there, he put an investor group together as soon as he heard about Mexico. Now, what he'd heard was from another Spanish captain who had landed at the mouth of the Grijalva River. And this is what you're going to see when you see Mel Gibson's Apocalypto. You'll actually, at the end of that movie, you see the actual landing recreated. Well, this guy had received a very rough reception from the Mexicans. Why? Well, this whole Spanish thesis was that it was, while a Pope had outlawed enslavement of Spaniards by Spaniards in Spain, he hadn't said anything about enslaving primitive peoples anywhere else. And so the Spaniards that were into establishing slave-based plantations had gone to other areas of the Old World, and also other areas now of the New World. And they had, their whole idea was to get gold. That's what they came for. Now, up until this time, they had the only gold the natives had brought them had been cold hammered gold that they found out of streams and lakes, and this had been disappointing to the financiers back in the Old World, in Italy and in Spain, and of course to Isabel, the woman who sent Columbus to begin with. But it wasn't long after that until the greatest gold strike in the history of Europe was made in Hispaniola. Real gold in mines, in ores that you could mine and then smelt. So that changed the whole thing. It created a huge flow of cash into Europe. It financed all kinds of things, not the least of which was the invention of these big blast furnaces in the Netherlands. At any rate, so we have going on here in Mexico at the time Cortez arrives. He's in Cuba. He's sitting there dreaming of there's got to be more just to the west of us where there's some real gold. We know that there's real gold here in the New World because now we're mining it in Hispaniola. This fellow, I think his name was Laureado, this one who first came to back from Cuba and said, "Man, we just found what you were looking for. There's a fully organized civilization over there. We must be Japan." So they Cortez and put together an investor group of a couple of hundred men. Now, these are men that have enough money to buy their own armor and their horses and their supplies, and bring with them whatever support they think they need to have at their own expense, and yet also pay Cortez to be a member of this expedition. This is a real investor's operation, and he put it together there with the participation of his new girlfriend's father, who was the governor of the whole island of Cuba. But this governor was very suspicious of Cortez all along, and so he discovered what he thought was proof that Cortez was planning on leaving him out of the whole operation, taking his bunch of mercenary soldiers and heading over there to undertake this conquest himself. So he tried to stop him. He sent some soldiers to arrest Cortez. Cortez found out about this from the girl that he was either his girlfriend by now or he was married to, and he took off. He and his guys got in their ships and they split before the soldiers could get there. They went around to the Santiago end of the island and they raided and stole all of the cattle that they wanted from the ranch of this particular governor, and then they took off for Mexico. What they were soon going to come Mexico. Right now they didn't know what they're heading for, except that the reports they had were that these were fully organized, state-organized, class-divided societies similar to their own that they had run into down here on the Yucatan Peninsula, and these guys had forced them out. Well, why did they get such a hostile reception? Well, it turns out that about 10 years prior to this time, a Spanish ship had crashed, and it had had at least 2 survivors on it, 2 men that survived, and they had intermarried with the local Mayan population. And they knew, of course, what the Spaniards' real objective was, what their mindset was. What they had come for was to steal as much gold as they could get their hands on, and that they would enslave these local people as quickly as they could get away with it. So they had told the Mayans about the Spaniards and what they were after and what they were willing to do, and the Mayans they took that warning to heart. One of those 2 men had been brought to Cortez when he landed on the island of Cozumel, which when I was first in the oil business in Mexico, we used to fly from Houston to Cozumel on a regular basis. Then after the new president came in, that guy had his own gang, and they had a new resort set up at Cancun, so we started flying from Houston to Cancun and then up to Villahermosa, which was the oil capital. So anyway, at Cozumel, Cortez had landed with his men, and he had heard the rumors about a couple of Spaniards that were out in the Yucatan Peninsula. He sent guys to search for them. They found one guy. One wouldn't come back. The other one would. He came over there and he told them everything that Cortez needed to know about what these Mayans were like. Became a translator of sorts because, of course, he spoke Mayan and, of course, he spoke Spanish. Well, Cortez then took him and his men, and they went around the Yucatan Peninsula and went right to the spot where this first Spaniard had said he'd run into these fully organized, state-organized guys that had real gold. So they got there. That's the mouth of the Grijalva River. I've been there many times because I live inland in the town of Villahermosa, which is probably about 50 miles from the coast as the crow flies. And I used to go down there to the beach with my wife and my dog Prince, and for some time off whenever we rarely got it. So I know exactly the kind of situation he's looking at, and I can't think of a worse place to try and invade at. But anyway, that's where they went. Now, the Spaniards got off their boat, so they went in there, and as soon as they got there, they found themselves confronted by true armed forces. That is, these are men with, they have only swords that are made of obsidian, with obsidian blades in them, but they have thatched armor, and those obsidian swords will kill you just as quick as a steel sword. And they also can cut through some of this armor. So these are guys that the Spaniards had to be afraid of. Besides, there's a ton of them. He's got maybe 200 men tops, and there's thousands of these guys coming after him, and they're coming after them in military formations. It's not just a bunch of natives on a bandit charge. This is companies moving up, platoons within companies taking the lead. Everything the Spanish are used to fighting when they're fighting other Europeans. The Spaniards have the advantage that they have steel armor and steel swords and spears, and they have cannon, which the natives have not seen before, and that scares them, but after a while they get kind of used to the cannon and the gunpowder too. Plus, the Spaniards have only so much of that. There's only so many of these muskets and cannons that they can fire, and once they've done their damage in the period of time that they're using them, they've got to go back to the use of swords and spears and armor for protection. So that fight goes on for a couple days. What saves Cortez from being eventually overwhelmed is that he lands horses and cavalrymen farther down the beach. They come around behind the Mexican army and they attack them from behind, that is the Mayan army. And the Mayans are temporarily discombobulated because, first of all, they've never seen a horse before, so that whole thing scares the hell out of them. And they're not sure what the difference is between the horse and the man that's riding it. So it's like an entirely new creature to them. So a lot of them just drop their spears and shields and take off. That is exactly what Cortez needs to sue for peace. Now, at this time, the Indians, they start thinking about this. Maybe we better try and figure out a way to buy this guy off since we're having a hard time running him off. And it takes a few days or a few weeks for them to realize that the horse and the humans are actually two different things, and to get a full grip on this. But in the meantime, they send messengers just in time for Cortez, because he's out of gunpowder, he's out of everything, and it's just a matter of time. His men are sleeping on the ground in armor with their sword in hand whenever they can catch some sleep, waiting for the mines to come back and give them the final coup d'etat when they, or coup de grace, when they send these emissaries there. And they send them there with a bunch of gifts. Now, about the worst thing you can give to a gold-hungry Spaniard is smelted gold. So what this did was to renew Cortez and his fellow adventurers their vigor, and they knew they were on the right track. Well, they brought him other things too, all kinds of gifts, and including about 20 slaves, which included a slave woman that they had captured earlier from the Aztecs. In Mexico, they call her Malinche today. She is a heroine of this early period. She links up with Cortez. Now, he's particularly interested in her for, well, she's a good-looking woman by all accounts of everybody that's written about it, and she also speaks Aztec, as well as because she was captured from an Aztec military family where her father was a captain in the Aztec army in Mexico City and in the area of Guadalajara. He'd been assigned out there, which, by the way, is where some of these early tools have been found that look like they were made from that time period that are metal. But at any rate, so she knew those languages, Mayan and Aztec, and she quickly picked up on Spanish. But she did that because Cortez had brought this Spanish Mayan interpreter with him, so she could answer Cortez's questions and have them translated into Spanish. And apparently she was a very bright woman, because she realized that her future now is tied to the man that owns her, and that she needs to satisfy him in one way or another if she's going to accomplish anything, and that means she has to be able to talk to him, so she learned Spanish quickly. Now, she becomes his closest advisor, his mistress, confidant, and translator. And they do leave the Mayan lowlands and they head up to the area we now call Vera Cruz. It comes from the name, Vera Cruz, the name that Cortez gave to the spot that he lands next in Mexico. In Vera Cruz, Cortez had his big first introduction to the city of gold that they had been hearing rumors about now for quite a while, and that they had decided to believe in. And the more smelted gold that they were being sent to them, the more certain they were on the right track, and they were on the right track. Now, to make a long story short, Montezuma, who was now the king of the Aztec Republic up here, was capable of fielding 250,000 men at any given moment with these kinds of bladed swords, thatched armor. The Spaniards had at best 200 men with Montezuma knows that these guys don't form any immediate threat to him because he can overwhelm them any time. But he also has the idea of buying them off and sending them away like the Mayans did. And he's aware that there are certain structural problems he has within his empire that make these guys dangerous. One is they come at exactly the same time that the mythology says that Quetzalcoatl is supposed to return. He had said they would come on white clouds. Well, that's close enough to the white sails of these Spanish ships. So Montezuma is worried about the effect that this mythology might have on disaffected chiefdoms that he's forced under his control that line the entire coast of Mexico, all the way from the mouth of the Grijalva River all the way up to what's now the Texas border. So that's another reason why he's thinking that if we could just buy these guys off and they go away, that would be the easiest thing for us to do. What he doesn't want them to do is he doesn't want the Spaniards to get the idea that they might be able to recruit an Indian army, which would indeed then put this whole thing on a new scale. Malinche knows that this is exactly the case, and she knows that what Cortez needs to do is to visit all of these chiefdoms up and down the coast and these primitive states that the Mexicans have subdued, and convince them that they should throw their military might behind him. The way he does that is by he goes north of Vera Cruz to some of the towns that have big temples that have been built there, and tears those temples down, and he puts up a Catholic church wherever that temple was located. And the locals say, well, he got away with that, and so his gods must be stronger than ours, and we got to have to pay attention to him. And he does the same thing south and along the coast of Mexico, the Gulf of Mexico there, south of Veracruz. So he's doing all of the right moves that Montezuma was having nightmares about. Of course, Montezuma doesn't know about this woman that he's got that's telling him everything. I could spend you a lot more time here, but if you want to read the full account of what happened, the best account ever written is, well, one was written by, the first one was written by Cortez Camp, a man named Bernal Diaz, who wrote a book called The Conquest of New Spain. He says he says at the end, when he's writing this biography, autobiography, and a story about how he was with Cortez the whole time, and right on up to the conquest of Mexico City. So that's the best source of information. Such a good source that the first American scholar of note wrote a book called The Conquest of Mexico, based on his book. Plus this fellow went over to Spain, and he went into the archives of the Spanish crown and found a lot of information about what had happened in that period of time from priests that had followed immediately in the wake of Cortez's arrival. Now, I don't want to spend a great deal of time on all of this, except to say it's all in your book, and if you're interested in the conquest, you can read it all there. You can read it in these original sources. On the way to Mexico City, and they finally decide that they're going to go to Mexico City whether Montezuma likes it or not. And by this time he's recruited a pretty big army of Mexicans that are disaffected and disgruntled with Aztec rule. To get to the highlands, they have to go through the kingdom Tlaxcala. Now, Tlaxcala is a town today in modern Mexico, and it's well worth visiting if you're a tourist. You can see some of the spots that we talk about here, but the key thing about Tlaxcala is it is the only part of the Mexican mainland that has not been captured by the Aztecs, but it has been blockaded for over 4 years, which means they've had no salt coming in to speak of, and none of the things that they really need. So they're in a real tight spot. Montezuma believes it's only a matter of time until he essentially starves them out, so he's been willing to wait. They have a fairly big army. And the city of Tlaxcala, at that time, when the Spaniards finally enter it, Bernal Diaz says this is the most impressive city any of these Europeans have ever seen, far more impressive than anything they've seen in Europe. Now that's just Tlaxcala. They haven't even got to Mexico City yet. So that gives you an idea of how advanced these people were. If they'd had metallurgy, they would have been at the same level as the Spaniards, but they didn't. So they had, that little bit was denied to them. The other thing that was interesting was that the ruling classes within Tlaxcala were anxious to have their daughters married into the Ronin. They didn't know they were Ronin, but these Spanish adventurers who they had put on the same level as themselves because of their military ability. And so these are guys that would never have been invited into the home or castle of anybody of any substance in Spain. But here they were being treated as if they were royalty or nobility, so they really liked this new situation. The invasion of Tlaxcala took about a week before, again, the Spaniards were almost defeated, and the Tlaxcalans decided that the best thing to do with them was to try to win them over. And that society of Tlaxcala divided into two wings. People that thought they should kill him, people thought they should marry him, and eventually the latter won out. So Cortez formed his first alliance with the city-state of Tlaxcala, and of course it paid off for them and for him. All of a sudden they had the things that they had been denied, like salt, hard stone, and so on, were coming in from the Spanish route on the coast, and of course, they're impressed by the Spanish cannon and musketry, their armor, and so on. So now he's got an additional army, a real army, put together of Tlaxcalans behind his group of coastal Indians and his 200 Spaniards. And so the march to Mexico City continues. It goes through several phases, but eventually Cortez gets to the top of what we call the Valley of Mexico, and he looks out over it. It was full of a lake, like Venice was at the time, with a big city. Not exactly in the middle, but very close to the middle. And it had 3 causeways, north, south, and west, leading into the city. So it was protected by water on all sides, and if you wanted to get there on a land route, you had to go across these relatively narrow causeways, which had been built up and taken over there. The Spaniards were, for the first time, realized what they had, that they had bitten off more than they could chew. And it also shows us that Cortez was wise, because before he left Vera Cruz, he'd had his ships dismantled and pulled up on the shore, because he anticipated that some of his men might get cold feet, run back to Vera Cruz, jump on those ships and take off, which is what would have happened about this time if those ships had been available to sail. But for the Spaniards were torn between 2 things: their desire for gold and their fear of the obvious power of the city-state that they were confronting. Make a long story short, Cortez had gone down into the Valley of Mexico. He'd been met on one of these causeways by Montezuma. Montezuma made the mistake of bringing him and his men back into Tenochtitlan, which was also called Mexico, which is today Mexico City. And in Mexico City, Cortez and his men had kidnapped him and taken him into a place where they had complete control over him within the city, and stole all his gold. So they were accomplishing their objectives, but naturally there was a lot of unrest among Montezuma's officers and among the people there, who wanted to liberate their king and kill these Spaniards. I'm going to skip over the rest of this story, except to say that eventually Cortez did drain this lake, and eventually killed Montezuma, and of course he got all the gold that was there. It's the beginning of the mythology of the lost treasure of Montezuma. I don't think anybody really believes there is a lost treasure of Montezuma. I know I never did. I think the Spaniards got everything they could get their hands on right there, and the rest of it went into the ocean, or into the lake, I should say. On their initial retreat from Mexico City, where they were being chased every step of the way, the Spaniards loaded up as much gold as they could personally on themselves, which was bad when they fell off of the causeway, and because, of course, it weighted them down and they drowned. Alvarado's leap Alvarado was one of the big captains that Cortez used in this entire process. There's a point where he had to jump across a break in the causeway. At any rate, these Spaniards just barely got out of there. The ones that did get out of there just barely got out of there alive, and most of the gold they had with them they had dumped on the floor of the lake on their way out. They made their way around the lake, and they got back down to the coast, and when they got to the coast, they got all of their ships, which were dismantled, and they brought them up again using this army of Indian porters that they'd recruited, brought them up to the lake that Tenochtitlan was sitting in the middle of, and now they had a navy to attack with. And so the story of the conquest of Mexico then really begins, because this is a life and death battle for Montezuma, which he loses. And well, there are many myths about treasures that Montezuma may have gotten out of Mexico City and into the Yucatan Peninsula or Guatemala. I would run into 400 years later, when I was dealing with a labor leader for the STPRM, the labor union in the oil field in Mexico, who was trying to convince me that he had found Montezuma's treasure. That's another story we'll get to later on. The point is, this idea of the lost treasure of Montezuma goes clear back to those days, and Cortez himself made a few searches in the Yucatan region in Guatemala looking for this thing. Never really found anything that satisfied them that there was even such a thing. I'm going to skip now to the history of modern Mexico, but that gives you some insight into what the earliest occupation of Mexico in terms of when people first arrived in the New World until the arrival of and the emergence of the state society in Mexico, the emergence of the Aztecs as an early empire that united these city-states under its own rule, and then the surprise arrival of Cortez, and which is also the same as saying the surprise arrival of the stage of feudalism. Now, feudalism and slavery, feudalism is a transitional stage, as we discussed before, between chattel slavery and the wage slavery of capitalism. But it has features, therefore, of both within it. And for the next 400 years in Mexico, what you have going on is the Spanish rulers, the conquistadors that are part of this initial army that survived all of this fighting, they set up their own haciendas, latifundias, very similar to what they would have had if they had been part of the nobility in Spain. And that's how they rule over New Spain for many centuries. Now, let's skip up to 1821. You'll recall that the revolution in North America from 1775 to 1781, that is, the armed struggle went on for 6 years, and it did more than just trigger the French Revolution of 1789. It triggered a lot of similar activity in Latin America, but especially in Mexico. So we have the first Mexican Revolution against Spain occurs in 1810. So that's not long after the U.S. has become a republic of its own, and its survival is in question as far as Europe is concerned. It's not in question as far as the North Americans are concerned, but I think they all realize that in 1810 that they're going to have to fight a few more European aggressors on their own soil. But what does happen in Mexico is that there's an indigenous revolution of Mexicans who are fed up with Spanish rule. This is led in large part by wealthy people that have been raised in Mexico and who have all kinds of differences that want home rule, in essence is what it is, and have all kinds of differences with Spain. Now, that independence of Mexico was greeted by European powers in different ways. The Juarez forces were eventually confronted by the French. Now, the French under Napoleon III got the idea that there was nothing that the U.S. could do if they intervened in Mexico, because in 1861, because the North Americans were already divided among themselves in a civil war. Now, Lincoln at the time was so convinced that it's just a matter of time until he defeated the South that he wanted to get into the Mexican situation immediately and get the French out of there, but his generals convinced him that let's take care of the South first, then we'll take care of Mexico. So he said, all right, if you insist, that's what we'll do. Now, it was probably a wise decision, because the first year of the U.S. Civil War did not go well for the Union. But in Mexico, in 1862, on the May 5th, that's Cinco de Mayo, that's where that Mexican holiday comes from, these Mexican Republican forces on their own defeated the Spanish in Puebla, the same state where we were talking about, where the Tehuacan Valley is located. And the Americans kept feeding them enough weapons to keep them into the fight, kind of the way the Russians are feeding weapons, I suspect, into the Ukraine today, enough to keep them into a fight. Or the way Stalin fed weapons into Stalingrad as he was getting ready to surround the Germans there, just enough to keep the forces that were there from being completely driven into the river. So the same thing was happening in the States and Mexico. So at any rate, as soon as the Mexicans managed to hold on to a part of Mexico where they could have a little government of their own, no matter what the French did. In 1865, when the war was concluded, Lincoln immediately sent his generals to make a deal in Mexico, and he agreed to send them everything they needed in terms of expelling the French. And the last of the French troops were driven out of the Mexican Republic the following year in 1866, and Maximilian himself was captured in 1867 and executed. That was the end of Napoleon's attempt to build a new world empire, Napoleon III. Now that castle in the middle of Mexico, it's called Chapultepec Castle. It's in the middle of this park, which is Chapultepec Park now in the middle of Mexico City, is still a big tourist attraction. And one of the men that I'm going to be talking to you about later, named Carlos Prieto, was born in that castle. So that'll show you that this particular guy that we're going to be talking about had come from the nobility section of to the degree that Mexico has a Spanish aristocracy, he had come from it.